Following along with this idea of assimilation and pluralism, we know that African Americans are highly acculturated, yet present or yet present a mixed picture in terms of integration. Native Americans are less acculturated than African Americans, and some tribes and organizations are trying to preserve American Indian cultures and languages. Overall, however, the strength and vitality of these traditions is probably decreasing. On measures of integration, there's some indication of improvement, but many American Indians are among the most isolated and impoverished minority group members in the United States. And that's because of, as you know now, the influence and the oppressive tactics and strategies that the dominant use to isolate and then exterminate them. The extent of assimilation among Asian Americans, of course, as we've talked about, is highly variable. With some groups, for example, third and fourth generation native-born Japanese and Chinese Americans virtually assimilated and successful, while others consist largely of newer immigrants with occupational and educational profiles that resemble those of colonized minority groups. And still other Asian groups have constructed ethnic enclaves and pursued equality by essentially resisting acculturation. Only European American ethnic groups seem to approximate the traditional model of assimilation, yet total assimilation is far from accomplished. Group memberships continue to be important because it continues to be linked to fundamental patterns of exclusion and inequality. The group division forged in the past and perpetuated over the decades by racism and discrimination will essentially remain to the extent that racial and ethnic group membership continues to be correlated with inequality and position in the social class structure. It's kind of turned into a chicken and egg conundrum. Some of the impetus behind the preservation of ethnic and racial identity may be a result of the most vicious and destructive intergroup competitions. In other ways, though, ethnicity can be positive and help people locate themselves in time and space and understand their position in the contemporary world. This ethnicity remains an important aspect of self-identity and pride for many Americans from every age group and tradition. And it seems unlikely that this sense of a personal link to a particular group's heritage within the United States is going to fade. Where you come from will continue to remain important for many people. But, for example, it was never an issue in my family where we came from, at least not that I knew of. And I don't think too terribly much about my English and Irish historical lineages. As U.S. society attempts to deal with these new immigrants and some unresolved minority grievances that come along with them, we should recognize that it is not diversity per se that threatens stability, but rather the realities of exclusion and marginalization, split labor markets, racial and ethnic stratification, urban poverty, and institutional discrimination that are the real threats. We have to remember to focus on the issues that confront us with an honest recognition of the past and the economic, political, and social forces that have shaped us. And by meaning, what we mean by being honest is those that are the dominant need to understand that their dominant tendencies and their gained advantage has to be given up, and those that have been dominated, they need to understand that it wasn't necessarily their fault, and that there were social forces that created problems for their groups that they have been born into. So as the United States continues to remake itself, and it is remaking itself, an informed sense of where we have been will help us decide where we go next. When we think about that, there's some important questions that we should ask ourselves. First, what blend of pluralism and assimilation policies will serve us best in the 21st century? Or essentially, what mix of being an American, but at the same time retaining your ethnic heritages, where's the magic number? A little here, a lot there, a lot here, a little there. How do we make that decision? And that's going to be an important decision as we move forward. Another question, are there ways in which the society can prosper without repressing our diversity? And is it even good to be completely American? You know, it becomes boring to me at times. I love interacting with other cultures or people that have different cultural characteristics than me. It's just, it's interesting. Another question, how can we increase the degree of openness, fairness, and justice without threatening group loyalties? So essentially, how do we get groups to respect other groups? It's individuals that will do that. And then, of course, how much unity do we really need? And how much diversity can we support? What we do know is that the one-way Anglo-conformity mode of assimilation of the past is too narrow and too destructive to be a blueprint for the future. But the more extreme forms of minority group pluralism and separatism might be as equally dangerous. So we don't want to have extreme separatism, but we don't want to follow the path that has been placed out in front of us from our past. So we have to figure out where the happy medium is. Some thoughts on minority group progress and the ideology of American individualism. In the United States has become more tolerant and open, and minority group members can be found at the highest levels of success, affluence, and prestige. So it's not like no one is making it up. It's just that the groups as a whole are doing way worse than the dominant group. However, it seems that negative intergroup feelings and stereotypes have not so much disappeared as merely changed form. They've become more modern or symbolic. We also think that many would argue that most serious problems facing contemporary minority groups in the United States are structural and institutional, and not individual or personal. And that doesn't take anything away from the individual prejudices and discriminations that one person can inflict on another. It's just saying that the large-scale institutions are going to do more damage to the group, and that's going to be more problematic over time. Survival and success in America for all minority groups has had more to do with group processes than with individual will or motivation. So as your group gains more access to the better world, the better things in society, you as an individual will follow along with that group. It's harder for an individual to break out of the group and make their successes. And a couple of final words here. U.S. society and its minority groups are linked in very fractious unities. And these unities are held together with weak bonds. And we have to be careful that we don't break them, because it's hard building those bonds, albeit weak at this moment, but it's even harder to reconstruct them after a conflict event. This society owes its prosperity and position of prominence in the world no less to the land and labor of minority groups than that of the dominant group. Even though the dominant group has benefited the most, it does not take away from what the minority groups have done to help build the United States. By harnessing the labor and energy of these minority groups, the nation has grown prosperous and powerful, but the benefits have flowed disproportionately to the dominant group, as we alluded to earlier. But this has got to change, and as we begin the 21st century, the dilemmas of America's minority groups remains perhaps the primary unresolved domestic issue facing the nation. What are the answers? Well, the answers of the past, the faith in assimilation and the belief that success in America is open to all who simply try hard enough, have proven inadequate, even destructive and dangerous, because they help to sustain the belief that the barriers to equality no longer exist, and that any remaining inequalities are the issue of the minority groups, not the larger society. It gives the structural part of society a free pass. Well, why do we need to help these minority groups? They're just deficient and they can't help themselves. Society that finds a way to deal fairly and humanely with the problems of diversity and difference, prejudice and inequality, and racism and discrimination can provide a sorely needed model for other nations, indeed for the world. And we're waiting for that society, folks. In many ways, the patterns of dominant-minority relations discussed in this text have been reproduced on the global stage. They were produced on the global stage during European exploration. The mostly Anglo-industrialized nations of the Northern Hemisphere have continuously exploited the labor and resources of mostly non-white, undeveloped nations of the Southern Hemisphere. Thus, the tensions and resentments we have observed in U.S. society are mirrored globally. The North and South divide is not something that is solely an American phenomenon.